Welcome, Real Life Christian Church. It is so good to be with you once again on this Wednesday night. If you're joining us, welcome to our midweek service. This is a space where we can have real, genuine conversations, candid conversations, frankly, about real issues that impact our real lives. And tonight, I am so excited to be with you and introduce our guests to you in just a moment. But, you know, if you haven't been a part of these midweek services before, can I just encourage you to check out our YouTube channel or our Facebook page, and you can actually just catch up on the conversations that we have already been having. A few weeks back, we had Dr. Lalith joining us from Sri Lanka, and that was an amazing conversation where we talked about the impacts of digital screens on our kids. And can I encourage you, if you've got young kids, go and listen to that conversation because you will be blessed and you will get a lot out of it. The last couple of weeks, we have been also speaking with our leader of the ACC Kids Movement, Andy Kirk, and I trust that you have also been blessed by that. So why don't you just get on that page and maybe share it with someone that's got kids and bless them as well. But tonight, if you are a parent of a teenager, or perhaps you just have teenagers that are in your life somehow, tonight is for you. If you have ever maybe experienced the ups and downs of the teenage ride, you know, the teenage life, and you've seen them go from highs to lows in their faith and in their Christian walk, then can I tell you that tonight is for you. I'm so excited here to be joined by parents, by our youth pastor, and also by a very special guest who I'll introduce to you in a second. But firstly, can I just introduce to you some parents that we have here with us tonight, some brave parents getting in front of the camera. To my left here, I have Eamon. Eamon is a part of our church, been with us for many years. He's a father of one child. How old is Ashlyn?
11, not quite 12.
11, not quite 12, so you're about to enter the teenage years. Bless you, brother. I'll get some advice from you later. And we also, on the other side, we have Evelyn, who is the master Jedi of parenting. She has 4 beautiful kids. What ages are your kids?
17, 15, 11, and 7.
Wow, okay. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here. In the middle, we have our very good-looking youth pastor, Jeremy.
Hello.
How's it going, Jeremy?
Good. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, obviously.
Good to have you. Good to have you. Awesome. On my right, I have a very special guest tonight. I actually met Rowan at Bible College. I did a very short stint of one of his courses called The Culture and Sociology of Youth. And I tell you what, I got so much out of it listening to your lectures. I grew so much. Some of the wisdom and the nuggets that were found in your lectures, I really appreciated. And so I am so excited to have you here tonight joining with us. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
Now, I personally know you as Rowan, the lecturer, the youth worker, maybe the youth pastor once upon a time. But could you tell us a bit about yourself for our church members that don't know you? How would you like them to know you for who you are?
Well, I guess first of all, I'm a local boy. I grew up on the east side, Ringwood Bayswater area, and so I haven't fallen too far from that tree. I'm one of 4 kids as well, and grew up in a Baptist and a Brethren environment, a solid home. Dad was chairman of the elders, and in many cases, growing up in that kind of environment, you almost feel like sometimes your life is almost defined for you. You're so-and-so's son going to so-and-so's church for so-and and so on. But as I said, I'm a local boy. Always had this interest in being involved in youth ministry, and our church did have quite an active youth role there. Through the various twists and turns, I went through a corporate role for a little while, which ultimately, for both my wife and I, we said this is probably not for us long term, and we took off overseas to study Bible, and from there really came back into youth work. For me, there's been always 3 things that have been vocational for me, which is one, it's actually I'm a nerd. I'm a geek. Like the academic environment suits me well, and so I've remained in that for the last 15 years. But within that, it's always been the lives of youth and young adults that have been really fascinating for me, and particularly the spiritual twists and turns and ups and downs and changes that happens through that time. And then discipleship has been the other thing, and if you can get those three things together, then that's the sweet spot for me, being in like a Bible college or academic environment, working with youth and young adults in discipleship. And so for the last 15 years, that's what I've been doing. Programs for 1 or 2 year programs for people wanting to take intensive periods of discipleship. And then in amongst that, for better or for worse, I undertook a PhD, because the kinds of questions that were emerging for me as I was journeying alongside young people who were having such a difficult time growing in their faith, it's really sort of pushed me over the edge to really want to research and understand that further. And so that was another 7-year journey that just wrapped up recently, and here we are today.
Wow, and it's a pleasure to have you. And I'm so excited about this conversation, because this area of youth and discipleship is something that I'm so passionate about also. And part of your bio reads this way, and I just wanted to read this out to you. Uh-oh, you're in trouble now. Everything on the internet stays on the internet. So I just wanted to read this small part of your bio. It reads this way. It says, Rowan perceives that one of the great challenges facing the church is the genuine nurturing of a personal faith throughout the challenging and irreverent years of late adolescence and emerging adulthood. Rowan's approach to holistic youth spirituality changes many to rethink contemporary discipleship practices in an effort to truly help young people practice authentic faithing in the context of fast-paced, meaning-focused, yet often doubt-riddled lives. Now, I'm assuming you wrote that yourself.
Guilty. Yeah.
Guilty. Can I ask you, what were you thinking when you wrote that? Not in a bad way, in a good way. What were you thinking? And can you unpack that? What does that mean to you? What made you write that?
Okay. So it's a great question, and I guess. So I have worked in academic circles for about 15 years, and I've come to understand that all academia is autobiography. Like you study to try and figure out what's going on around you and what's happening in you. When I first started working in a Bible college, I was in Ringwood at Tabor College, and we had a 1-year program happening there. And I was 3 or 4 years out of Bible college. I'd been, for the last 3 or 4 years, formally employed for the first time as a youth minister. And so in many cases, I was like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and perhaps ill-equipped, I think, maybe, or under-experienced at least. And what became really challenging across those first few years was, even though I was running a program of intensive discipleship for young people, and even though I was in a Bible college, what was really fascinating and a little bit scary for me was the folks who were coming to attend this program. About a third of them I came to call stretch and grow Christians. And it was a positive encouragement for them. Like, they were feeling confident and secure in their connection to faith and to their faith community. And when they interviewed them, why are you here? It's like, I want to grow in my faith, I want to dive deep into God and dive into scriptures and understand. They were the kind of words they used. But there was this other group, and it was about a third of them, and they were like, I've got some questions. And they're not small ones, there's some big ones. And the thing is, I'm having trouble finding answers or even anyone to help take these questions seriously. And I didn't know where else to turn, so I went to Bible college to figure that out. But then even more surprisingly to me was there was a third that they were angry and they were hurt about their faith. And maybe they'd been hurt by people of faith, or that their kind of faith world had in some sense sort of fallen apart for them. And when something so central falls apart, it's like your whole life kind of falls apart, and they're looking to put back the pieces together. And again, they had come to this program and to this college to go, I want to put these pieces together. And so there I was in a program that had young, enthusiastic, bouncy, stretch and grow, take me as far as you can, to, I'm not so sure, to some of the things that these folks, the stretch and grows, were so excited about, these ones were really angry about. And it was A, really complicated. See, I'm an academic, I talk in dot points. And B, working out particularly how, like, I felt more confident working with the stretch and grows and feeling like I couldn't stuff that up too much. But with people that were right on the edge, so to speak, or really hurting, that was a much more complicated, and to work out how do I companion these folks well became a really challenging prospect for me. And so it was those early years that really propelled me into going, what is happening across these years? How does faith grow? Is there a science of how faith grows? Can we speak of it that way? And are there some smart and dumb things that we can do along the way here? And I don't think I've got the corner on this at all, but that has been the motivating factor for my continued engagement with this age group and with studying and researching in this area for a while.
Wow, that's great. And I know, I mean, there's a lot of things that you just said, and I know that the parents and Jeremy are really, really probably just thinking through what you just said. Feel free to jump in and ask questions at any point. What I was going to ask you from what you just mentioned around the way that faith develops or grows, you know, I think that it's interesting probably in a lot of Christian circles where there could be this perception of a young person either has faith or they don't. So it's like either you're in or you're out, right? And are you able to describe what you mean by that, by that growing in faith? What did you find from that?
Okay. Oh, that's a wonderful question. All right, so I said before I'm a geek, and my kind of area has been a very small and little known area of theology that's called faith development theory. And there's just a small group of people that since about the 70s have been working, and their angle on seeking to approach this question of trying to understand faith and to try to understand, is there kind of a way that we can understand how it grows and milestones, and to really shape our ministry practice and our pastoral engagement with young people around this process of, you know, Colossians 1:28, presenting everyone whole or complete in Christ. And their take, which fascinated me, was they tried to bring together the science of human development, psychological development, social development, biological development, and then to take that learning and bring it across to theology and go, can we speak about faith development? And not just can we take the inside of that and see if there's a way that faith grows, but maybe these disciplines or these developmental domains, areas of our lives, maybe they even talk to each other, that just as we grow up biologically, and part of our biology growing up is our brains growing up, and our brains growing up then affects our psychological development, and as our psychological development, that affects our sociological or our social development, being able to take things. Maybe all of those also pile in to affect our faith development. And so if we can understand what's changing when humans change, we might also start to understand what's happening when faith changes. Or to say it another way, the study of faith development is to understand the Spirit's engagement with the ever-changing and developing humanity of ourselves, and then figuring out how to participate with that. Now there's a whole kind of world down that road, and I've almost forgotten what your original question was. Oh, faith growing, there we go. All right. So that was kind of my pathway in, because the area of faith development then specifically sought to understand faith growth, and it was both really enlightening for me, and I'll say one thing that was really enlightening and then one thing that was really challenging, and then we can go from there. But the enlightening and encouraging thing was, in faith development theory, it's very comfortable with the idea of questioning and doubting and speed wobbles in your faith and so on, because it understands that as being the place of growth. And we can talk a bit more about that. But as I started to understand that when change happens, normality is disrupted. And so when faith change happens, your normal, comfortable, everything's okay, gets disrupted. And so when your faith is disrupted, which I used to be worried about, thinking that stretch and grow was strong faith, and these people with big question, that was weak faith, I had to leave those categories behind to go, you know what, there's a lot going on in terms of faith with the hugely questioning and hurt by. There's as much going on there as there is with stretch and grow. It's not a question of strong and weak. They're very different change trajectories, but there's as much going on. And where disruption is happening, change, transformation is happening, sometimes in huge ways. And once I started to go, oh, okay, I just found myself starting to calm down a little bit and go, all right, I need to change my metaphors here. It's not that the wheels are falling off the cart, although it does feel that way for people. It's not that everything's broken and in tatters, though it definitely feels that way for people. There is extraordinary change happening here, which I dare say maybe even there's extraordinary work of God, where the grace abounds. Grace is abounding in these moments. And so it was a kind of a flick of the switch and a change in focus to kind of go, oh, maybe this is okay. Maybe there's wonderful things happening here. And so that was kind of like an encouraging thing. But the flip side of that is it's kind of scary to kind of go, so the pathway of faith means extraordinary change can happen. Faith is not a narrow road, it's a much broader kind of enterprise where people can be shifting and changing much more, and they may change in ways that I'm sort of not so comfortable with, but I need to be careful to say, maybe that's not faith, maybe that's just something that's larger than what I've experienced before. And that's really challenging and was really challenging for me. And maybe a third really challenging thing, second really challenging thing was there's no silver bullet here. Like, as much as I wanted to, ride in on a white horse and just save the day, this is mystery, this is soul, this is spirit, this is faith. Certainly there are smart and dumb things we can do. Certainly there's lots of ways we can learn and grow to participate constructively with young people in their lives. But there's no silver bullet. There's no button we can flick. And because I recognized in me just wanting to insulate people from big change. I wanted to save them from it. It's like, not your role. God grows people. You participate and play along. Your task is to tune your eyes in and your spirit in to discern what's going on and to participate with that.
Can I just ask you, because I can imagine as a parent, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a parent with a teenage kid, and from what you've said, probably two things that stand out that I'd be asking as a parent. One of them, and I know we've got parents here, feel free to ask the same. One of them would be, I would be encouraged to know that the questions that my teenage son or daughter has is not the end of the world, right? It's not something that I should be fearful of, but it's something that I should encourage them to explore, right? So I think from that perspective as a parent, I think there's a sense of peace that I would be getting. But the second part, which is more of a question, is, and to clarify what you are and what you're not saying, obviously we're not saying that, that God changes, right? We're not saying that we're saying that God, we're not saying that God doesn't have absolutes, but we're saying that we as people are changing, and the way that God works sometimes in our faith development is not static. Is that correct?
Yeah, okay, that's a wonderful clarification. So if I can respond by way of analogy, maybe if you can imagine being in a friendship relationship with someone and you've known them for a number of years and you enjoy spending time and you have all these things in common, and then all of a sudden you learn something new about them which you didn't know before, and you go, oh, and maybe it's something shocking that you never knew before, and you have to go all the way back and rewrite everything that you knew about that person and kind of recraft that story. There's a wonderful story of a New York essayist who wrote a story about really struggling with her father all the way through. She was a migrant post-World War II trying to make their way in America. Her dad was really tough and so on and so on and so on, and really kind of constraining and holding on to her and very fearful of kind of letting her kind of grow into her, and then right when he's near his deathbed, she starts to understand a little bit more of his story, starts to understand the extraordinary impact of losing all of his family through the death camps and so on and so on and so on, and he just didn't want to lose anybody else, and she just had to rewrite all of her teenage stories of this nasty, controlling father, right? Now, her father always was who he was, right? But her new piece of information, her sudden awakening, her recognition of this other part of this story completely rewrote her relationship with her father and I think that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, that God is. God is as God yesterday, today and forever and so on, but we're growing up. We're changing. How a 2-year-old, have you ever felt wildly misunderstood by your child? It's like, that's not who I am. You're experiencing me as this, but that's not who I am. I'm trying to get through to you who I am. But sometimes they just, they're so angry that they can't get it, or they just don't have the developmental capacity to kind of empathize with the complexity of the situation, or you're minimizing their screens and they don't understand that it's in their best interest or these kinds of things. You're just an ogre at this particular point in time. You need to rewrite this story upon them. I think the same is true for us in our relationship with God. When we talk about our faith changing, we're not talking about God changing or what is ultimately theologically true changing, but our relationship to it can just change and must necessarily change. That the way we believe as a 2-year-old, we would want to grow up. We don't want to believe the same way as a 2-year-old, as a 7-year-old, as a 14-year-old. Now, certainly, come to me as a little child, and there's various ways in which the experience of faith that is of a child is blessed. But childhood is a blessed and grace-filled era, but childishness, I'm not quite so sure. The call to grow up into adulthood, to become wise, the Psalms metaphor of wise and ancient trees with roots that run deep to living waters is kind of the image of what we're growing towards, and that is an extraordinary journey of faith and change across our life course.
That's great.
Can I ask? So, when you talk about the from the young kids, so say for example an 11-year-old and then a 15-year-old, they kind of, like, there's a huge gap there, and then you kind of think 11-year-old still very much child, and then a 15-year-old, like I said, big gap, and there can be such a big change in that jump, and it's just that transition from the young mature mind to the all of a sudden understanding teenage things now. It's suddenly switched on. Yeah, and so when you talked before about our life journey and our faith journey being the same, I guess what I'm getting at is how can I go about, say for example, making those steps a little bit easier? Because there seems to be, even in our culture, in our youth culture, there seems to be a just a big jump all of a sudden from being a child into an adult, and they don't kind of slowly process into that. It's just like you turn 12 and you need to behave differently, you need to say things differently, and now you need to think adult things, but it's like there's no slow progression, and then I think there needs to be those steps, and I don't know how to rein it back, maybe.
That's a wonderful insight. I was thinking as you spoke how we have a door jam where we've been measuring our kids. Right. And even just this morning, actually, I had our eldest up there because he walked down the stairs. I'm like, good gracious, get to the door. Where are we up to here? And he's going at 2 inches every 4 months or something at the moment. Like, he's really growing quick. But he hasn't always grown quick. All right. So there's periods of life where it's not so much change. There's all these little marks at the bottom where we're furiously marking them all the time. There's not much change going on. And then we forget for a year, and then all of a sudden there's this much difference. And that's, in some sense, that's how, one of the great insights of these developmentalists was to say, it's not actually like this. It's not smooth. And in fact, they started to say, we actually tend to live in one of two experiences. We're either in a period of consolidation, where with what we have, we need to do it better. And then we're in a period of transition where what we need to be able to do, we don't have the capacity to do yet. And so in your observation, which was brilliant, these huge shifts that we start to see happening, often it's like nothing's happening, then bang, something happens, right? So on the one hand, usually there's a lot going on. So as we talked about with change, we don't change by choice. Often we defend ourselves against change because change hurts and it's unknown and so on. So we actually kind of hold our breath, like we try and hold it together until it breaks, and then you kind of break into a new era kind of thing. And so you can think about this in school. You might learn a new technique in maths or something like that, and you'll use that technique all the way through until you get a problem where it goes, I can't use this technique anymore. I just can't do long division anymore. I'm going to have to factorize this or something like that, and you'll avoid using it until, a new piece of technology comes along. Just use the old apps, and then they don't update that app anymore, and I have to go to a new one, and it's a whole new way of being, all right? So we stick with ourselves until we're forced to break through into the new, and so that's partly why that happens. Now, your question was, how do we participate along with that? I'll just say one thing at this stage, which is why I love being a student of development is you just start to understand what's going on when change happens. And being an interpreter for someone that can, because when something changes, you just don't know what's going on and life's not working and you have a fight with so-and-so and things just feel terrible, basically. And if you can interpret for them, not how to fix it, but just what's happening, you can see people kind of go, oh, okay. So when you go to the doctor and you go, my toe's sore, it's really bothering me, I've got, and he says, oh, you've got Pophalongulitis epilopolis or something like that. All you need to do is pop this cream on it and you'll be fine. You go, oh, thanks for interpreting that for me. A lot of my anxiety can calm down now because I know that, you know, my toe's not going to fall off. I just need to do X, Y, and Z. So the same that when these big leaps happen for our kids, sometimes just simply being alongside and being able to interpret their experience or interpret how others are perhaps changing before them just can calm things down. So I was talking with my sister's daughter who's been having a really tough time at school and being treated in ways that feel very poor by her friends. And so we sat down and said, look, relay these conversations to me. And so she described, well, then they did this, and then they did this, and this, and then you can ask a question. Well, what do you think that person was feeling at the time when they said that? Oh, they were really angry at the time, right? So they gave you, and it just helps that person to interpret the situation and go, all right, so they said those words because they were angry and hurt. So maybe they didn't want to hurt you. Oh, maybe they didn't, you know. And it's not to excuse behavior and all that kind of thing. You're just becoming an interpreter of change, an interpreter of what things are transpiring for the person, and you can feel it start to just calm down. You can see that then parenting becomes a bit more of an alongside role, an interpreter, a coach, a resourcer. It's not quite a you should. There is times for that, and that's entirely appropriate. But when things are very disrupted and they're disoriented, if you're a person that can help orient them to at least what's happening, you can feel them start to calm down and settle into what's being asked of them.
Are there indicators that parents or signs that parents could look for to distinguish, because we're talking about their teenage kids changing, to distinguish between questioning, if you like, or change that, you know, is leading towards a mature faith versus questioning and behavior that's just damaging? Yep.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So there is a statement which is there's no such thing as a dumb question. And it's kind of true, but there can be...
But my question's dumb.
No, yours is terrific. But there is a sense where no question is a dumb question, but sometimes the attitude behind it can be not terribly constructive. So there are questions that are intended to tear down and questions that are not. And there's a sense where... in the same way when we try to interpret a difficult situation, or maybe if you're in conflict with a person or you're having a difficult time with your child, the first move is behaviour management. All right? So they're always doing this and you really want it to stop. And so we're going to talk about behaviour and invite them to stop. Now, if you sort of go with like the iceberg model, behaviour is the bit that shows above the water, and then there's 9/10 of the thing going on underneath it. And part of the a way of thinking about behaviour is it's always motivated by a want, a need, a desire, something like that. And if you can address or turn the conversation to understand that want or desire or need, if your young person's willing to do that, it can be often a much more constructive conversation, right? And so the same thing with questions. Questions are the surface of an uncertainty, all right? But sometimes that uncertainty is, I'm asking you this question because I'm annoyed at you and I want to tear your perspective down, all right? And you could then manage that behaviour, or you could recognise that they're angsty about something. I wonder what you're angsty about. Okay. I guess my shorthand way of responding to you then is, while my eldest is 16, so I don't have the luxury, I'm still waiting to parent a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, and I haven't cut my teeth there. On the other side, I've been working with largely 16 to 26-year-olds for a little while, but I realise that I've had a luxury in that role where I can just be curious, right? I'm not their parent. I do feel a high level of responsibility, but I've just found an extraordinary softening and an opening of a conversation when I take a position of non-judgmental presence alongside a young person and utter curiosity about where they're at. And if there's something unconstructive about the questioning cycle, that tends to kind of abate, because often the things that are unconstructive or unhelpful disappear when you have a really good and true conversation about what's really real. All right, and when you're having a fight about what's not real, you're just having a fight. I think there's part of the response to you as well, which might see this conversation a little bit differently as well, is one of the big thing that changes across these adolescent years and into young adulthood is a shift in what we call the locus of authority. Okay, so as a parent, you got the locus of authority for young kids, right? When they're really young, you get to say when they go to sleep, what they eat, how much they eat, what they wear. It's all sorted. When we hop out of the car, hold my hand, we're walking across the car park this way. That's how we roll, all right? Now, that boundary of freedom, which is really narrow when they're a child, sort of, in some measure, necessarily expands as they show responsibility to handle the freedom that they're given. And the locus of control is therefore shifting. But we're also looking for the locus of responsibility to shift, all right? And they're two different things. You can start to allow a child to have control over, say, how their room is organised and stuff, but if you're still taking responsibility for washing their clothes and all that kind of stuff, the control's shifting, but maybe not the responsibility, and you've got to sort of get both, right? Now, in terms of faith, how you do life, how you do faith, you want the same thing to transpire, all right? You do want a young person to own their own faith. You do want a locus of control to shift from the child who's had their faith interpreted for them by their parents and by their faith community and by their church and so on, to begin to make up their mind for themselves and in committed relationships with their community. So it's not an individualistic thing, but we still need a locus and they need to find their agency here. And that's one of these heavy negotiations that transpires between parents and child and between youth leaders and kids and pastors and youth groups and so on, is this sense of progressively we are passing on the baton to you. We want you to develop the capacity to make up your own mind so that you can own your own. The downside of that is they're going to develop their own minds. They're going to make their own choices, and you want them to be responsible ones, but at some point we have to relinquish the right to control that and hope that the capacities and the skills and the critical competence that they've developed over time means that they start to make wise and good choices that honours the truth and reality of who God is.
And I think something that I've experienced with that is, especially with the kids being younger and now being older, there's so much word that you can just impart, like biblical word, like this scripture and this scripture and this scripture, but I think when they see something come to pass, or a prayer come to pass, I think maybe like things like that shouldn't be kept between my husband and I. Like they should be put out in the open and spoken about out in the open. There's been this prayer and that experience that we have as faith, I think builds up in them as well, that they are seeing, they've prayed, and those things have happened, and they've experienced God in that sense, and I think it kind of rubs off on them.
That's again, it's a wonderful observation. There's some people that approach faith development think about things that they call faith indicators, or strengths, or maybe even protective factors for where you the kinds of things you'd want to see in young people as they're growing in faith. And the more sort of thoughtful, nuance, that could be a terrible way to look at things, because it could be behavior management, how many minutes are they praying and so on. But one of the ones is, does a young person naturally integrate conversations of faith and life together? Do they just naturally weave together, is sort of one of the indicators to kind of say, okay, this is becoming integrated. It's just a natural, they don't have to shift gears between these two and so on. And so if that's modelled for them, if parents are routinely interweaving faith and life conversations, if it's part of normal dinner time conversation to say, have you heard about this answer to prayer that's happened, or to say there's this difficult decision that we need to make and there's ethical things, but because we believe this and we interpret these scriptures, we sort of naturally weave these things in. That's the kind of thing that from the outside in, a young person can then go, it's a natural conversational thing to include. It's not a gear change kind of stuff. And if that's modelled in the home, it's more easily soaked into the life of the young person who can then take that forward as well.
Before we sort of move on to another question that I wanted to ask you, if I'm a parent at home, and if you could summarize like what you've just said, everything that we've just said. I'm a parent at home and I've got a 17-year-old son or daughter who just does not seem to be owning their faith for themselves. You know, doesn't want to come to church. The friends that they keep seem to be leading them down the wrong path. Perhaps doesn't have a sense of responsibility, perhaps. What could you encourage me with, as a parent?
That's both a wonderful and a frightening question, because there are, perhaps if I can say that there are many variables at play, and let's just pick off a couple of them. So on the one hand, developing faith is always a process, never an event. And we talked about change before as this, there's a sort of a lot happens under the surface and then bang, something happens, and a lot happens under the surface and then bang. And sometimes what happens in these kinds of scenarios is a lot of things have been happening under the surface, or you just, like life got busy and you weren't quite tracking as closely with your kid, and then all of a sudden, bang, you realise, hang on, things are really different for them and they're not kind of in a faith space that I would like them to be or that I'm comfortable with. If coming to maturity in Christ is always a process made up of an event, just be careful not to make a process an event. And what I mean by that is if it really feels like you've recognised things have got to a space where you're not comfortable, one of the knee-jerk responses could be, I'm going to suddenly batten down. I'm going to double down. I'm going to bring in the edges really tight, and you will go to church, and you will wear a tie, and you will, and you will, and you will, and you will, and you will. And I'm going to try and suddenly create a 180 degree in this, where this trajectory is going, really kind of quickly. And while there are revolutionary moments in people's life, while the Spirit of God can bring extraordinary conversion moments, it's not terribly common for that to coincide with a parent suddenly having a whole dear moment and suddenly bringing the reins in, okay? And so there's a bit of a mantra that I say to myself is if it's taken a while to walk in here, it's going to take a while to walk out, okay? And if the trajectory is really in the wrong direction from what you're comfortable with, first of all, come to terms with the fact that you're dealing with your discomfort of where they're at, and you don't want to be speaking out of discomfort towards somebody. All right, that just makes for anger and retribution and so on. Okay, so just taking stock of that to start with. 1. 2, curiosity is always your friend. Always, always, always. All right, you don't know what you don't know. You can see what's going on and you may not like it, but you don't know why it's going on. Until you know why it's going on, you got nothing. That's not true. You've got love and care and all of the years that you've had together and all the rest of it, but until you can understand the why, it's very difficult to have below the level conversations around some things. So curiosity, seek to understand the why of this particular moment. And then 3rd, think of it like turning the QE2, not a rowboat. All right. My son went canoeing on the weekend with a proper professional canoeist, and their canoes they just spin on a dime, and he was tipping the thing over all the time. All right. And faith tends not to work like that unless it's a real kind of intervention of God. If it's you interacting with them, we're looking at turning the QE2, which is a sort of a turning circle of about 2 kilometers or something like that. Like it's a huge kind of radius. All right. And so beginning to seek to make particular small changes that are moving in a direction, but bearing in mind the more you're interacting towards something that is your preferred opinion, it is the introduction of an agenda, and it is the introduction of a sense of control in, for example, a 17-year-old, where the agency power, locus of control things going on, and that it's a difficult thing. Okay, and so again, I've had the luxury of not having to be the parent of these students, but overwhelmingly I found curiosity, seeking the why, and I probably will say this then, that allowing young people to see and experience the consequences of their choices is a great teacher, knowing that they're always accepted and have a place of belonging no matter where it goes, okay? And there's a fine line there between allowing the consequences to roll and that may be difficult for the person to experience that, always letting them know that you embrace and accept them, even if you don't necessarily agree with some of their choices. That's a fine line, all right? I'm thinking of some parents that I know for whom their third child was just different to all the rest, was just the classic black sheep, was, and just for whatever reason just never appeared to be interested in matters of faith, and started making all sorts of choices that were really difficult for their parents. And I think, bless them, the parents made a wonderful choice that at some point that you could see that they kind of sat down, eyeballed mum and dad together and went, we're going to do belonging first, and then behaving, and then believing, right? Because if we give up on the, while you're under my roof, get out kind of thing, and expect their behaving and believing to change as well, we've got nothing. So no matter what, we're going to do belonging. You're a part of us, you're part of our family, we're not going to kick you out, all that kind of thing. We have these preferences, we have these convictions, but we're never going to kick you out. So belonging first, and from the space of, a young person trusts whom they belong to. Because I belong to you, I'll hear your voice. All right, because you continue to give me a place of being and attachment, there is respect there, right? And sometimes, so don't trade on the belonging. It's going to take a while. They've walked into this place. It'll take a while to walk out. Be curious and find the why.
Awesome. So, I think both in some of the lectures that I attended and in the conversations that we had a little while ago before we started recording, we talked about the whole stage of adolescence taking longer than what it used to. So again, could you tell me, I'm a parent of a 30-year-old, why can't my 30-year-old decide what university course they want to finish and stop playing video games and maybe get out of my house?
Why? All right. So sometimes this gets called failure to launch. But we like this era and this generation. It's an interesting generation, and here's one of the humbling things that this whole faith development thing taught me. If you listen to the sociologists who understand or who study how societies grow and change over time, their insight, which is kind of sort of a slap in the face, is that whoever was the generation before, they set the stage for the generation to come. So as much as us oldies kind of might look at the youngies and go, why can't you be more like me? In my day, ... What's kind of interesting though is we set the stage. Like we created the environment. It's Gen X's marketing to Gen Y's, not the other way around. So there's something humbling about that to sort of say, before we shake the finger too strongly, we set the stage for this, and we might want to kind of examine the way that they've stepped into, inherited a society and a world, and are taking it on the next step in some sense. Now, so change is going slower. Here's a really strange fact. Excuse me for getting biological for a second. We're pretty certain that from about the 1600s backwards, the average age of puberty onset, at least in females, is 14. Right? And that may have been even right up until the 1900s. And from about the 1900s onwards, it's declined by 2 to 4 years on average in the space of 100 years. Right? So for millennia, it's pegged at a certain point, and then in the last 100 years, it's changed, particularly in the West, and gotten younger and younger and younger. So that's an interesting sort of biological change that's moving the start date of adolescence younger, that somehow we've impacted at a cultural level, right? So we've changed people's biological responses to life by the way we've culturally organised our life, and maybe by the way we've pumped hormones into food and all sorts of things, all right? But so that's an interesting, on the one hand it's getting younger. Now, here's the other side of this, again, is that it's not just that adolescence is getting longer, life got longer. The end point was much younger, all right? So the whole of life concertinaed out, all right? We're very focused on the young adult years, and it has concertinaed out a long way, but the whole lot kind of concertinaed out, all right? So we're empty nesters much later, and everything's sort of, the government wants to make our retirement age later, right? Because we're a little bit healthy for a little bit longer. So everything's changing, all right? Now, a big thing then for young people is they grow up in a global village. So no longer do you grow up in my little village. We went and visited in Austria, and we lived in the Pinzgau Valley, and the Pinzgau Valley has got like dirty great big mountain on this side, dirty great big mountain on this way, and their own little dialect of Austrian. Why? Because they lived isolated for centuries until they figured out how to drill holes through mountains and drive cars through them. And then we started to get a little bit of pluralism and a little bit, and then it started to change, right? But when you live in an isolated little bubble, life's simple, it's more straightforward, it's regulated, you know how to move from childhood to middle years to adulthood. Often there are markers, all right? Now we live in a global village, so all possibilities are there. That kind of clear, demarcated pathways to how you grow up, well, that's wildly diverse. And as we've become increasingly affluent, the level of choice is extraordinary now. So our young people face a dilemma. All right? On the one hand, we adults, maybe rightly, want them to grow up, to take responsibility for life, to step into their adulthood, to do the adulting kind of thing. It's now a verb. To get your adult on and take responsibility for your life and kind of get moving. But they step into a world that, one, we set the stage for. Two, is wildly pluralised and diverse, with bazillions of opportunities and extraordinary choice and option. Remembering that as soon as they say yes to one thing, they say no to a million others. And so when a young person hits their 20s, they are at their most capable self physically for the next 10 years. Most of the psych development has happened at that point, so they're very capable in terms of their thought process, a lot of the social process. They're ready to launch into the world of possibility. And they're in a world of possibility, the last thing you want to do is set down roots and anchor yourself and say, right, I'm going to cut off that possibility, and I'm going to cut off that possibility. I'm going to, and so to say, right, I'm going to live here and marry that person and have these kids and live in that job and do this for the rest of my life at age 20, to a 20-year-old is like, you're kidding me. Why would I say no to all this possibility yet? I haven't even tried it out yet. I don't even know if this is a good idea just yet. So I'm not saying that all immature behaviour is excusable, but I do understand that growing up now is infinitely more complex than it used to be. They say that children routinely deal with a level of stress that previously adults rarely dealt with 40 years ago. Right? They just live in that level of stress because it's so much more complicated now. So I do have a level of patience for young people to take some time to grow up, but the same rules apply. Be curious. Help young people experience the responsibilities of their choices, the consequences of their choices, and take responsibility for that. And they become necessarily needful to make decisions, to say yeses and to, by implications, to say no to certain things, to begin to make their way through life. But that is to say, I do have a high degree of empathy for them. It's a tough time.
Sorry. When you were saying before about there's so many more possibilities and there's just so much to choose from that I don't want to make a decision because, one, I might make the wrong decision, but not only that, I might miss out on something else. And so I think that's a huge maybe issue with the culture of, as you're going into young adult life, of, you're finishing school, having one 17 where they have teachers where they're like, what are you doing? And they're like, I don't know. Well, you need to know. And it's like, well, I don't know. And so they have 16. That anxiety of, I have to make a choice now, but then I don't want to make a choice now. And I think I've lost my question, but I think maybe just the anxiety of the too many choices is it's hard to explain that you don't have to have a choice. I do remember myself being in school and saying, well, I have these options, not as many as they were today, and I will choose this. And it was relatively easy for me, but now I see that it's not that way these days, and it just the variety and the choices are.
I gotta say, I struggle to choose a Netflix movie to watch because there's so many
that's
choices,
the same.
let alone what I'm
like
going to do the
40
rest of my
minutes
life.
of choosing, and then there's half your movie.
That's right.
And there's also how, like, what is an authority? What authority do we use to make choices? Right? So they say in a postmodern era, what is true is what works. Right? Because in an era of facts and alternative facts, it's hard to. But if it works, well, it's true enough. And so, right. So if you think about that way of thinking or that way of choosing, then a 17-year-old trying to make a career choice for the next 20 years, I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know if, right? So sometimes their fear is not even around, is it the right or the wrong decision? It's just, is it the best decision that I could possibly make? And I just don't know until I try it just yet. And so gap years and so on are not just are a thing now because we have a capacity to choose. There's a level of affluence that enables that to happen. You know, we don't have to go straight out and work into the fields to supply a family income to keep our household going. We've got some choices now to be able to do that. But also there's a sense of it can be helpful to see what's out there. You know, I'm mindful of a person who I interviewed as part of my research work up in Sydney, and they were making some very poor life choices living in the area where they were and just got into a bad scene. They finished high school and they took off overseas and spent a lot of time in South America. And in the end, that experience, which their parents weren't keen on, was like, oh, if you don't go to university, they'll never come back. And I'm not a poster boy for gap years, although I spend a lot of time with young people who do gap years. But it was... He left as a person who you thought he's just going to go nuts overseas because now there's no constraint, there's no barrier, you know. And in the end, he watched people carefully on the backpacking trail. He saw the kind of crazy things that they did. He began to participate with some of the vulnerable people in different societies, and he worked in different. He went to kibbutz in Israel and in other kind of poor farming communities. And he came back, and he's now running an Indigenous advocacy group in the western suburbs of Sydney and such. And so for him to experience the haves and the have-nots, to see how capitalism was kind of a scourge in different particular areas, was so sharpening for him that he came back to kind of take his place. All of that to come and say that, yeah, it is difficult for young people to make their choices, and they are heavily reliant on experience or the experience of others to some degree to be able to make their decisions. But again, this locus of control, your experience is important, you know, so how do you choose what's on Netflix? Find out what other people liked. Right?
Yeah.
But at some point, you've got to go through the process yourself. And so, you know, universities are bringing in internships and all sorts of things so you can try out stuff as a way of being able to make decisions, which then you can think about that in terms of faith. Yeah, I need to try and see that these things are true.
Sorry. In your work and in your research, one of the things that's going through my head sometimes, not making a choice, you end up with a choice you may not want. Especially with women, talking about biology, there's a certain clock that runs out at a certain time. But my main question is, in your work, have you seen the benefit of faith make any difference to the average, with kids being confident to make a decision? Can I encourage my daughter to maybe have faith in God to make a choice rather than just saying, oh, I'll see what's there and you know, wait a couple of years or whatever? Can faith make a difference to this failure to launch, or is it kind of across the board?
That is such a wonderful question, in a way that I'm kind of frightened of. That's a really interesting question. So I'm gonna reflect some things which may be challenging to hear, and I'll state these not as arguments, but I think as observations that I've seen in young people, all right? That the participation in faith and in faith communities obviously varies wildly from church to church and person to person and so on. And so the impact on people, young people, of their faith and how they go about making choices is quite apparent to me, or is quite apparent. And sometimes it works very positively and sometimes it works negatively. So on the negative side of things, I've seen young people who, for example, are so focused on trying to discern God's yes in their life as God's will that they don't make choices. Do I do this or this? I'm going to wait for God's direction on this, and then they make neither choice, and then they're left with option C kind of thing. And so while I applaud the willingness to surrender their will to the will of God, that's something you're like, yep, okay, that's great. There's a broadening that we want to make there to go, number one, are you also tuning into God's no? Like another way to make that decision, which I see in the disciples in Acts, is they tried to go this way and the Spirit said no. And they tried to go that way and the Spirit said no. And so the process of discernment can actually be, let's start moving. Let's try something, always with an ear to the Spirit to go, yeah, no, you know. So that's another way to go about discernment. So to be people of faith can be incredibly helpful, all right? But sometimes we narrow that definition of how faith should be enacted about something. Another way that faith can be interesting is, like I've seen young people make decisions towards a career path, for example, in marketing, all right? Now, I'm not a huge fan of marketing. I grew up, like my first degree was in commerce and I was in marketing, and it took me sort of years to kind of realise that I was unaware of the way I was, that's a different kind of story, but like I was unaware of the way I was constantly seeking to influence the thought life, or you know, it's kind of to my chagrin that, you know, marketing is kind of founded on mining the vulnerabilities of people in order for them to sell stuff. And it took me a while.
Social dilemma.
Yeah. And, you know, I participated in that for a number of years before it's like, oh, geez, I'm part of the problem here. So, you know, people heading into marketing with the eyes of faith to go, surely we can redeem this, all right? Surely we can participate in this industry as people of faith in order to. So that's an example of sometimes our way of understanding faith is narrow, and we'll say, well, you can't do that because that's bad, or you can't do that because that's bad, or you can't do that and that's bad. And a slightly broader view is, well, how can I participate in this industry in order to bring its redemption? How can I bring it in order that? Thirdly, people of faith are surrounded by a community, and there is nothing, I think, more developmental in a young person's life than being surrounded by interested and concerned adults, parents and non-parent adults. Right? Fuller Youth Institute are a wonderful research group in the area of young people. They have this idea of a 5-to-1 principle. And what they found was when they researched young people, for the young people who could name 5 interested and concerned adults, and by interested and concerned, they were more than that, not parents, so outside of the parenting group, they were adults for whom they would go to with concerns or questions or something's going wrong and I need support from you. So, you know, and the adult by return was interested in them, knew stuff about them and actively followed them up. So interested and concerned adult. If a young adult had 5, their capacity to make really smart choices, to succeed really well at school and just went through the roof. Right? And when that sort of finding started to expand out into the youth work world, the secular youth work world, they started to go, yeah, actually, you know, we've been isolating kids and surrounding them with professionals, call them teachers and coaches and when one of the most constructive developmental environments for young people is if they're just surrounded by uncles and aunties and other non-parent adults who are interested and concerned in their life. They grow up. These adults provide what we call social capital for them. So we in the West have actually kind of stripped that away, but when people grow up in the context of faith, in churches and ministries and so on, where they're surrounded by adults, it's a wonderful protective factor because they go, how do I make this decision? What was influential for you? If I head this way, do you know anyone who can help me? And so it's interesting that faith in the context of community can be incredibly helpful for young people.
I just to add to that, obviously I'm not a parent, so a lot of this is kind of just gone over my head, but I'm really like enjoying listening to this, and I'm getting some really cool information out of it. I think my question, just on the back of that, is how can we, this is more to do with like youth pastors and youth leaders, how can we kind of form this like united front, I guess, in line with parents to better influence and grow the faith in kids? How can we better align with parents on that kind of front, if that makes sense? Right. Yeah,
that's wonderful. The first thing I'd like to say is churches and ministries that partner with parents and adults to raise faith in kids, it's a powerhouse. It's an absolute powerhouse. Some folks may have heard of a group called Think Orange, and the idea of red and yellow coming together makes orange. When you've kind of got church and parents working together, it's an extraordinarily powerful environment. And so there are a million ways at an organised ministry level that you can do this kind of stuff. All right. So churches that really switch into this are doing things like parallel programming. So we're talking about this issue or exploring this issue with your kids on this particular youth night. Parents, you can come at the same, drop your kids off here, go next door or down to this particular house or whatever. We're going to explore that topic with you. We're going to tell you everything, the kinds of things that we're telling your kids as well. And for the next week, you're set up to have a million conversations right now. So you're just getting that kind of overlap to parallel life going on. Second of all, as a parent, it's hard to choose your kids' friends. You sure as heck can choose their adults. All right. And so we, it's just when I started to clue into this fact that the non-parent adults were a thing, I just started stacking the decks for my kids. And by shoulder tapping people and saying, I've seen that my eldest really likes hanging out with you. I just want you to know that I think adults are just the best gift for young people. And I'm not, not putting any pressure on you, but I just want you to know that if you're interested in his life and he really digs being around you and you can help that. Now, you got to do the safety thing and all of that kind of stuff. But we kind of fluked on this. We were lucky enough that when I was doing the youth and young adults pastor, we started a small group for young adults that were kind of falling off the back of the truck of church. And there was like 10 or 12 of them to start with, and then as it happened over the course of like 6 years, 4 of them paired up into couples, and the whole thing kept going for like 10 years. And it happened at the same time that our kids were like 1, 3 and 5, and so for the next 10 years they grew up where every fortnight this pack of people that were sort of about 20 years older than them were always arriving, having dinner at our place, and this kind of rhythm started happening where they'd come around for dinner. And then our kids who still needed to have, books read to them and so on, would pick who was their favourite young adult there and say, can you come up with that? And I didn't even know this stuff back then. We were just fluked enough that what we call the nest happened. And now some of the dearest people for our young kids are these people. Now, a couple of them are in America, a couple of them are in the Barossa, a couple of them so on, and we really grieve them moving away. And we were already talking about intentional community, can you stay here? And then after a while we realised our kids are going to move. If my kid takes a gap year, then I sure as heck want him to go and hang out with Uncle Rory in New York, and I sure as heck want him to go and see David over and Rach over in Adelaide and so on. So that's been a tremendous blessing for them. So you can choose your adults. Last thing is you can build little rituals into your kids' lives and your teens' lives which routinely bring these adults around them. So one of the simple things that we do for birthdays is our kids get to choose their birthday party every second year. That's with their peers. But every year they have what we call special adults dinner. And so usually on their birthday, we'll have an informal dinner and they'll invite 3, 4 or so adults around who've been particularly present to them for that particular year and come round, share a meal, and then the last part of the meal before we do the birthday cake is we run around the circle and have basically an affirmation circle. Just one thing that each adult has observed about a young person, and we write it down in a book kind of thing. And that's just created a little ritual for us that continually connects and reconnects our kids with adults who are interested in them, because kids aren't interested in adults. So it takes the initiative of the adult to just reach into the young person's life, and knowing that they have permission to do that is helpful, and you can kind of tee that up from a parenting point of view.
Sorry, I have a question about what you said before about kids that have fallen off the back of the truck from other churches. So I was telling Melody that I was speaking to my friend about what we were doing tonight, and she threw me a few questions as well. And namely, the fact that, so we went to youth together, grew up together, went to youth together, got married together, and did life pretty much together. But the thing was, the youths that we had going to our church were pretty much the same, because we lived in a lower socioeconomic area. Some of the parents went to church, some of the kids were dragged along, but others would come and go a lot of the time. And so they were seen as, it's a harsh word, but like the rejects. And, we would like, anyone can come to church, but there seemed to be an atmosphere of, you were once here before, how could you have fallen away being a young adult? There seemed to be an element of shaming, and we can see it now as we look back, but I think the question is, how do you... it's almost like a reconciliation of not so much them with God, but just of yourself, and maybe how you're seeing that person, or how can you... Maybe they're seeing it themselves, that because they've fallen away and maybe they feel shame, is it coming off them onto other people? And how can we come alongside them, I suppose, and not have that atmosphere in young adults because of maybe the culture, that they've been pulled in to the culture, and then they've come back to church, and then they've been pulled out again, and then they've come back to church. I think that...
So let me hear if I'm hearing you correctly, that sometimes as faith, I'll say it like this and then tell me if I'm hearing you correctly, that sometimes as faith communities we build environments that are very strong belonging environments, which is great. And the downside of becoming a strong belonging environment is the clique, and that it unfortunately can create a kind of exclusion, which is difficult. And when belonging communities begin to form, which is wonderful, you have your own language and your symbols that are meaningful and your stories that are meaningful, and for those for whom they're not meaningful or they don't get it, they kind of stand out a fair bit. And it's one of those unfortunate downsides of the extraordinary belonging system or belonging way, which is so formative and so wonderful when you're in, is difficult when you experience it as an outsider or a temporary in and out and so on. And so on the one hand, you don't necessarily want to reduce the belonging element because it is so warm and it is so wonderful, and it nurtures faith in a wonderful way. But you're being aware of its downsides is really important. Again, I'll mention Fully Youth Institute here. They released a book called Growing Young, and that was a work to the church to say, yes, we want to, help young people to grow in adult faith, so to grow up in their faith. But as churches, we don't want to grow older; we want to grow younger. Right? We want to take the age profile, which tops out at the top, and actually get that, bring that down, kind of thing, and share. And one of the ways that they observed is that to the degree that the adult community was experienced as a place of warmth for anyone younger, it was a key factor for them. And as soon as you name it and then locate it as a value or an ideal that we're moving towards, that the adults begin to go, all right, if we're going to grow young, then church is not about us, all right, or our ideals or so on. Our task here as a community is to be a place of warmth for the next generation down, right? And if we operate as a belonging system, not for us, not for our own country club, if we operate as a belonging system for the next generation, then that next generation will feel like their task is to become a belonging in community, a warm place of warmth for the next generation, and so on. And then all of a sudden the vibe changes. Right now, again, a funny story was a church that my family go to does a wonderful job of being a warm place, and part of that is it's a heavily family-oriented church, so kind of everyone knows everybody, but they see each other so often that they don't feel the pressure of, I only see you on Sunday, so we have to catch up, because they see each other so often. When we get together, there's a kind of an openness that kind of like, I can talk to you, but I don't have to because I see you at other times, and that's just been a really helpful dynamic for them. And so as a high schooler, I was talking to a nephew of mine, and they're like, I had this really funny experience the other day, Uncle Ro. Yeah, what happened? He goes, well, I brought a friend to church. Okay. And what was that like? He goes, he thought it was the weirdest thing ever. Why was that? Was it the music? Was this? He goes, no, all that was fine. Like, that was fine. He goes, well, what was it? He goes, well, I walked in the door with him, right? Yeah. And there was this guy over there, and I knew him. He's Rex. And Rex said, hey, Joey, how's so-and-so going with your grades? Yeah. He goes, oh, no. And this interested adult said hi to him and acknowledged something about his week and so on. And 2 more steps later, and another person, and then another person, and then another person, and they finally got in and kind of sat down, and his mate, who's never experienced the interest of adults before, went, what's with this place? Everybody knows you. And bless my nephew, is like, I know, right? Isn't it awesome? You know. And so like it's such an unusual commodity, and it's such of high value that it's experienced so rarely. It is such an extraordinary gift of grace and a ministry to others.
What we try to do for Connect is that we just try to make a place where we are able to be vulnerable and open with one another. And I think that's probably what in youth, like I talk a lot about with the kids, that they need somewhere else, like you said, not with other adults, not with their parents, but with other adults that they can be vulnerable with, and they can be real with, and they can know that whatever I say, they have my back.
Yeah, that's great.
I definitely think that's really important, and I think from personal experience as well, having that kind of other outlet as a youth in youth ministry at the time, I definitely needed that kind of different perspective as well. That wasn't my parents, for example, so that's definitely needed.
Awesome. I absolutely want to get into this topic around, how faith matures and the formation of faith. But I think for tonight, we have run out of time. So I want to thank you for being our guest tonight. We are going to continue this conversation next week. So I hope that you've actually been thoroughly blessed and enjoyed this conversation. But please tune in next week, because there's more to come. You don't want to miss it. 7 p.m. next Wednesday night. We'll see you guys then.